I had no tent, only a wool blanket rolled tight at the top of my pack. I spread it on the ground and leaned back. Before I tell you about the desert that nearly took my life, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood on the edge of something vast and wondered if you had it in you to cross it? If you have, tell me in the comments. I want to know who is listening tonight and what distance you once had to face. I was 20 when I first set my boots toward the desert. The year was 1958, the summer I decided I would not spend another season drifting from one odd job to the next in our little town. I wanted something more than patching fences and sweeping store floors. So I left with a canvas pack, a tin canteen, and the last $7 I had earned swinging a hammer at a construction site that shut down before it even put a roof up. There was a rumor that men could find good pay at the copper mines across the dry flats in the south. All I had to do was get there. No bus ran that way and I had no horse, so I set out on foot, figuring I would hitch a ride from a trucker on the highway. I remember my mother pressing 2 boiled eggs into my palm before I left. She did not say much, just told me to drink whenever I found water and to keep moving before the sun got high. The first few miles were nothing but gravel shoulders along a road that shimmered under the morning heat. I passed a single billboard for a motel and a rusted windmill that creaked in the breeze. I still believed then that the desert was just a stretch of sand and thorn, something you could walk through if you were stubborn enough. I had not yet learned that a desert is not empty at all. It is alive in ways that do not favor a boy on foot. By noon, the tar in the road was soft under my boots. Heat shimmered up from the ground as if the earth was breathing against me. The first truck that passed did not even slow down. The driver leaned on his horn and left me in a cloud of dust. I waved the grit away and kept walking. I followed the road until it bent east and fell out of sight behind a low ridge. That was where the true flats began. The land spread wide and pale like bleached bone under the sun. There was no shade, not even a tall cactus to lean on. The air had a dry metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. I pulled the canteen from my pack and took 2 careful swallows. The water already felt warm, like it had soaked up the sun inside the metal. By late afternoon, the highway had gone quiet. No trucks, no cars, nothing but my boots crunching on grit. The horizon rippled in waves of heat that made distant rocks look like water. That was the first time I realized the desert was going to test me before I even reached the mines. I found a patch of scrub where the sand met a ridge of cracked stone and decided to stop for the night. I had no tent, only a wool blanket rolled tight at the top of my pack. I spread it on the ground and leaned back against my pack, hoping the night air would be cooler. As the sun slid down the sky, the heat bled away fast, leaving a chill that seeped through my shirt. When the stars came out, they looked close enough to reach, but their light gave no warmth. That first night I lay awake, listening to the sigh of the desert wind. It sounded like dry grass scraping against itself. I remember thinking of my father's words when I was a boy, that a man finds out who he is only when there is nothing left to hide behind. Lying there with a half-empty canteen, and the horizon stretching endless in every direction, I began to understand what he meant. The desert does not care about your plans. It asks you a question with every step. Are you willing to keep going? I told myself I would answer yes, at least until sunrise. At dawn, the desert woke before I did. The wind that had whispered all night went still, and the air turned sharp with cold. When I sat up, the horizon was painted with a red band of light that looked almost like fire beneath the edge of the sky. The sand, still cool from the night, felt damp against my palms. I shook the stiffness from my arms and packed the blanket tight again. The canteen was lighter than I liked, a third of its water already gone. I had no choice but to ration it. I told myself I would not drink until mid-morning, no matter how dry my mouth felt. The first few miles passed quietly. The road I had followed the day before had thinned into little more than 2 dusty wheel ruts. It wove between low ridges of stone where the sun had not yet reached. My boots left a dark print in the dew-specked sand that vanished within minutes under the growing heat. By the time the sun cleared the ridge behind me, the desert had changed its face again. The cold air lifted and a wave of heat pressed down so fast I could feel the sweat dry as soon as it formed. The horizon quivered under the glare, turning distant rocks into mirages that looked like pools of water. I knew better than to chase them, but I could not stop my eyes from hoping each shimmer was real. Around mid-morning, I came upon the remains of an old way station. Just 2 weathered posts and a collapsed beam that might once have held a sign. A single sheet of rusted tin leaned against a pile of stones. Someone had tried to build a windbreak there long ago. I stopped in its narrow shadow and rested until the sting in my calves eased. A lizard darted out from under the tin, paused to watch me, then disappeared into a crack in the earth. It moved like a quick shadow over the sand. I took a measured sip from the canteen, swished it around my mouth before swallowing and pushed on. The sun was higher now and the ground ahead lay bare and exposed. No brush taller than my knee to block the light. I walked with my eyes on the next ridge, using it as a marker to keep myself from counting steps. By noon, the heat became something more than warmth. It pressed against me like a heavy hand. My shirt clung to my back and salt dried white along the seams. I started to notice a dull ringing in my ears whenever I bent to adjust the strap of my pack. That was when I knew I had to find shade soon, or risk wearing myself out before the second night. At last I found a shallow arroyo where flash floods had carved a gash through the sand. A jagged outcrop of stone leaned across it, throwing a sliver of shadow against the wall. I slid down the bank, sat with my back against the cool rock and let my legs stretch out on the sand. The wind that drifted through the cut carried the faint smell of something dry and sweet, maybe sagebrush further up the ridge. I tore one of the boiled eggs in half, ate it slow with tiny mouthfuls of warm water. The yolk crumbled like chalk on my tongue, but gave me enough strength to push on. I closed my eyes for a while, just long enough to hear the faint drone of insects somewhere beyond sight. When I climbed out of the arroyo, the sun was sliding west. The shadow of the ridge ahead was starting to lengthen. I felt a flicker of relief at the thought that I might reach the next cluster of scrub before full dark. The desert seemed endless, but it had its patterns. Hollows that hid shade, ridges that marked dry creek beds, distant shapes that told you there was still life out there, even if it stayed out of reach. That second night, I stopped on a rise of hard-packed earth with a view of the flats below. The sunset burned the sky orange and violet. I thought of the copper mines beyond that horizon and wondered if there was truly work waiting, or just another rumor. Either way, I knew I had already crossed a distance I would never forget. I lay down with the canteen at my side and the pack under my head, feeling the desert cool beneath me again. Above me, the stars came out clearer than the night before, cold and bright enough to make the emptiness seem vast yet strangely familiar. I told myself I had survived the first 2 days, and sometimes that is all a man can promise himself. One more day. By the third morning, the desert felt less like a place and more like a living thing that had decided to test me. Its silence had a weight of its own, and I woke up feeling as though it was waiting for me to move so it could decide what to do next. The night had been cold again. I could see my breath when I blew into my palms, but as soon as the sun showed its rim, the air shifted, turning the chill into something sharp and dry. I packed up my blanket, shook the sand from my boots, and studied the horizon. The ridge to the west looked closer than the day before, which gave me a reason to start moving. The first hour went easy. I walked steady, trying to keep my pace even so I would not waste the little water I had left. I let the thought of the copper mine pull me forward, promising myself that once I reached it, I would find a well, maybe even a bunkhouse with a roof. But as the sun climbed higher and the light turned white against the sand, I noticed that the ground ahead had begun to shimmer again. It wasn't the soft mirage of yesterday. This one danced like liquid metal, convincing enough to make my steps quicken. By late morning, the canteen felt like a stone against my hip. When I shook it, I could barely hear the water slosh. I told myself to hold out until noon, but the heat kept pushing that promise out of reach. Sweat had stopped running down my face and my lips felt like paper. I knew that was a warning sign, so I gave in and took a swallow. Too big a swallow, and felt the water run down my throat without relief. That was the first time I began to wonder if I had made a mistake crossing this place alone. At noon, I found a dry wash where the wind had carved shallow steps into the walls of sand. I climbed down into it for shade and sat on a flat rock. I pulled off my boots to check for blisters. The soles of my feet were raw but not torn yet. As I sat there, I noticed something strange in the sand. Prints, half covered by drift, leading deeper into the wash. They weren't animal tracks, they were boots, older than mine and wider. I couldn't tell how long they had been there, but the sight of them stirred a mix of hope and caution. It meant someone else had been this way before, maybe recently. I put my boots back on and decided to follow the trail for a while. The prints led me along the wash for nearly a mile before climbing back up to the flats. There, the wind had erased them completely. Whoever it was had vanished into the desert as if the sand had swallowed them whole. I stood there staring at the horizon, trying to guess if I had been chasing a shadow or if someone was still ahead of me. The rest of the afternoon stretched into a slow march. I stopped counting hours and focused instead on counting the number of steps it took to reach the next patch of darker sand or the next rise in the ground. When the wind picked up, it blew thin veils of dust across the flats, stinging my eyes and leaving a dry taste on my tongue. Toward evening, I spotted the twisted remains of what might once have been a wooden signpost. Only a single weathered board clung to the post by a rusted nail. There were no words left on it, just faint grooves where letters had been. I rested there, leaning my shoulder against the post, feeling as if I had reached a milestone, though it told me nothing about how much farther I had to go. When the sun dipped low again, the desert changed colors once more. The sand turned copper red, and the shadows of distant boulders stretched long fingers across the ground. I found another rise to camp on, away from the wash where flash floods might sweep through in the night. The stars came out as sharp as needles in the dark sky, but I barely had the strength to appreciate them. I sat with my knees drawn up, staring at the glow of my small fire, thinking about the tracks I had seen that afternoon and wondering if the desert was big enough to hold both me and whoever had left them. Before I lay down, I marked a line in the sand with the tip of my boot, an old habit my father had taught me, just to know in the morning if something had passed too close in the night. The fourth morning began with a haze that made the sky look bruised. At first I thought it was just thin clouds drifting low, but when I brushed the grit off my blanket, I realized the air itself was heavy with dust. The wind was changing, carrying the smell of dry earth that had been stirred far beyond the horizon. I moved slower than the days before. The ache in my calves had deepened overnight, and every step sent a small jolt up the back of my legs. My lips had cracked enough that they stung whenever I tried to whistle to keep my pace steady. I saved the last few swallows of water for when I could no longer bear the dryness. The morning stayed strangely quiet. Even the little desert birds that usually darted from bush to bush were nowhere to be seen. That silence was more unsettling than any howl I had heard on earlier nights. It felt as though the desert itself was waiting to spring something on me. By late morning, I saw the first sign of the storm. A distant smudge on the southern horizon rose like smoke against the pale sky. The wind came in short, hard gusts, carrying fine grains of sand that scraped my cheeks. I pulled my scarf up over my mouth and nose, lowered my head and pushed forward, hoping to reach the shadow of the next ridge before the storm reached me. The smudge on the horizon thickened quickly until the entire line of sky ahead turned the color of rust. The gusts became steady, then stronger, tearing at my shirt and stinging my arms. It was like walking into a wall that was determined to shove me back. The sand burned against my skin as if the desert had decided to peel me apart grain by grain. I spotted a cluster of boulders to my left and staggered toward them. The space between two of them was just wide enough for me to squeeze in and crouch with my back to the wind. I wrapped my blanket around my shoulders, pressed my face into my knees, and waited. The storm roared for what felt like an hour, but might have been less. The air grew darker until I could not see my own boots. Each gust rattled the stones around me, and every time I coughed, the taste of grit filled my mouth. I thought of the tracks I had seen the day before and wondered if the man who left them had faced the same storm or if he had already made it out. When the wind began to ease, the world returned in fragments. First, I heard the scrape of sand sliding down the boulders, then a sliver of daylight broke through the dust-filled air. I crawled out of my shelter and found that the storm had erased my own footprints. It was as if the desert had decided to start my journey over from that very spot. I drank the last mouthful of water right there beside the rocks. The swallow was small, but it loosened the knot in my throat enough for me to keep going. I knew I would have to find a new source of water before the next day, or my trip would end in that stretch of nowhere. The afternoon sun returned hotter than before, as if to remind me that storms bring no mercy, only another kind of hardship. I walked on shaky legs toward the distant ridge I had been aiming for since morning. The land there sloped downward, and I prayed that somewhere in its hollow there might be a well, a creek bed, even a seep of water hiding under the stone. By evening I found a dry gully where sparse tufts of grass clung to the edges. I dug at the base of one clump with my hands, hoping for dampness, but the soil crumbled away dry as bone. I camped there anyway, too exhausted to climb further. That night I lay flat on my back, staring up at the stars. The storm had swept the sky clear, and the constellations shone harder and closer than ever before. I thought of the stories my father used to tell about travelers who followed those stars across the frontier. For the first time, I truly understood why they named them guides. I chose the brightest one in the southern sky and fixed it in my mind as my marker for the next day's march. By the fifth day, I felt like a husk of the man who had stepped off the coach at the edge of the desert. The last of the water was gone. My lips were cracked enough to bleed, and the edges of my vision had started to blur whenever I bent down to adjust my boots. I moved slower now, dragging each step as if I were carrying stones inside my chest. The morning sun climbed without mercy. I tried to keep my eyes on the horizon, but the glare burned until I had to squint. Every stretch of silver heat ahead looked like water waiting for me, only to vanish as I drew near. Each time the mirage faded, a new one shimmered a little farther out, teasing me to keep walking. Around mid-morning, I began to see the tracks again. This time, they weren't scattered prints in the wash, but a clear set of wheel ruts, carved deep into the hard ground. The sight of them made something stir in me, a thin thread of hope that perhaps there had been a wagon carrying supplies or even other travelers heading to the mine. I followed the ruts, telling myself that where a cart had gone, there might be water spilled or a barrel left behind. The tracks led me over two low ridges and into a shallow basin ringed by boulders. That was where I saw it. A single wooden supply cart half sunk into the sand at an angle, one wheel broken, the canvas cover shredded by wind and sun. For a moment I thought it was a mirage again, but as I came closer the shape held firm, its shadows falling true. The cart's bed held nothing but scraps of rope and a cracked lantern. No food, no barrels, no signs of who had abandoned it or when. Still I searched every corner of it, even prying up the slats of the floor in case something had rolled beneath. All I found was a small metal cup wedged under the bench. It was dry as dust, but I kept it, telling myself that a man who plans to live cannot afford to leave behind even a cup. I rested in the shade of the broken wheel, using the cart as a windbreak. The air smelled faintly of old canvas and sun-baked wood. I took off my boots to air out my feet, noticing that my socks had stiffened with salt. The skin between my toes was raw and tender, but there was nothing to do for it except keep moving. As afternoon wore on, I faced a choice. The wheel ruts that had led me here continued on, vanishing into the far flats, while the ridge to the east promised slightly higher ground, where the land dipped and rose as if it might cradle a dry creek bed. I chose the ridge, trusting my memory of how water tends to hide in folds of earth rather than out on open flats. The climb drained the last of my strength. By the time I reached the crest, my knees shook under me and I had to sit before I lost my balance. From that higher ground I could see miles ahead, a land of red and ochre ripples broken by a thin line of darker green that hinted at mesquite trees. Where there are trees, I told myself, there is at least the memory of water. I slid down the far slope on shaky legs and kept my eyes on that distant line of green. I promised myself I would not stop again until I reached it. The sun followed me down, throwing my long shadow across the sand until it blended with the rocks ahead. When I finally reached the mesquite grove, the ground under the trees was dry but softer, as if it had once held moisture. I dug again at the base of a tree with the cup I had salvaged, scraping at the roots for any sign of dampness. There was none, but the grove gave me shade. and at that moment shade felt like a gift worth more than water. I made a small fire with fallen twigs and sat with my back against the largest tree, watching the horizon darken into deep violet. The wind in the branches above me whispered like water running over stone, and for the first time in days I allowed myself to close my eyes before the stars came out. At sunrise, the mesquite grove looked almost gentle, its branches lifting like dark fingers against the pale sky. I had slept in short bursts, waking whenever the wind rattled the leaves, but even that restless sleep had given me enough strength to stand without swaying. The first thought in my head was water. Without it, I would not see another sunset. I set off following the slight dip in the ground that cut through the grove, reasoning that a channel wide enough to hold the roots of trees might lead to a hidden seep. The sand underfoot was softer, speckled with tufts of grass that hinted at deeper moisture somewhere below. I dug again at each promising spot, sometimes with my hands, sometimes scraping with the metal cup, but each hole came up dry. Around mid-morning, I noticed something pale lying half-buried beneath a drift of sand. At first, I thought it was just a stone bleached by the sun, but when I knelt, I saw it was the curve of an old tin canteen. Its leather strap had rotted away, and when I shook it, I heard nothing inside. Still, I pried the stopper loose just in case and was rewarded only with a puff of hot air that smelled of rust. I tied the canteen to my belt anyway, hoping it might serve to carry water if I found some. The ground sloped downward again toward a narrow ravine where low cliffs of crumbling sandstone cast jagged shadows. I descended carefully, using the roots of brush for balance. The air there felt slightly cooler, and I saw a thin streak of darker soil that traced along the base of the rocks. It was damp enough to crumble beneath my fingers rather than scatter as dust. That small sign was enough to stir a surge of hope. I set to work digging at that darker streak, deepening the hole inch by inch until the sand grew heavier and the soil clung to my fingers. I could smell the earthy scent of damp clay rising from it. At last a bead of moisture gathered at the bottom, then another, until a shallow pool no wider than my palm formed. It was far from a spring, but I cupped it carefully and sipped. The water was warm, tinged with grit, but it tasted like salvation. I filled the old canteen drop by drop, letting each trickle seep in before adding more. It took almost an hour to collect barely half a cup's worth, but that was enough to give me a second wind. I drank sparingly, allowing the water to sit on my tongue before swallowing, feeling the soreness in my throat ease. The climb out of the ravine was slower than the descent. The sun had risen higher, and heat radiated off the sandstone as though the cliff walls had become furnaces. I rested twice in the shade of rock ledges before finally reaching the top, then turned my eyes south again, toward the faint line of distant hills where I hoped the copper mine lay. The land ahead seemed flatter than ever, a plain of ochre and red stretching to a wavering horizon. With water in my canteen, even if barely enough to wet my lips, I felt a renewed determination. I told myself that as long as I could keep moving from one patch of shade to another, I could survive the crossing. By late afternoon, I reached a cluster of stones where the wind had piled sand into a shallow crescent. I made camp there, placing my pack as a pillow and draping the blanket to shield my face from the last rays of the sun. My muscles trembled with every movement, but my spirit felt steadier than it had in days. The desert had given me a small mercy, and I meant to honor it by not wasting another drop. That night I drank only enough to wet my cracked lips and listened to the distant sigh of wind moving over the plain. I could see the stars again, sharp and uncountable, and I thought of the road behind me, the cart, the storm, the mirages, and realized I had already left the boy who began this journey somewhere back in that endless stretch of sand. On the seventh day, the desert tried one last time to claim me. The sunrise was clear and sharp, the kind of morning that fools you into thinking the day ahead might be kind. But by mid-morning, the air grew heavy with heat, thicker than anything I had felt yet, as if the sky had lowered closer to the earth. I started early, hoping to cover as much ground as I could before noon. My canteen still held a shallow pool of the water I had gathered from the ravine seep, but I guarded it fiercely, taking only a mouthful when the dryness in my throat began to scratch. Each swallow felt like pouring a drop of life back into myself. The plain stretched flat for miles, its red surface broken only by the occasional rise of stone where small shrubs clung to life. My boots scuffed small clouds of dust with every step. The strap of my pack had rubbed a raw patch on my shoulder, but I ignored the sting. I had learned that once you start paying attention to small pains, they grow louder than hunger or thirst. Near midday, I noticed a change in the horizon. To the south, a faint haze of grayish-brown drifted upward, too wide and low to be a cloud. At first, I thought it was another dust storm brewing, but as I shaded my eyes, I saw faint shapes beneath the haze. Structures, not rocks. The sight sent a jolt through me that I barely dared to trust. It meant there might be people ahead, maybe the mining camp I had set out to find. That flicker of hope pushed me forward faster than I should have gone. The sun pressed down harder, reflecting off the pale sand until my vision began to swim. At one point, I stumbled and fell to my knees, feeling the grit scrape into the torn skin at the edge of my boot. I stayed there a moment, head bowed, breathing slow and shallow while the taste of hot metal lingered in my mouth. I forced myself to stand again, leaning on the broken supply cart's metal cup like a walking stick until my legs steadied. The line of haze grew clearer as I walked, showing darker outlines of roofs and tall beams that looked like the frames of mine shafts. The wind shifted and carried a faint smell of smoke and something sharper like oil. That scent told me the camp was real and close enough that the breeze could reach me. Late in the afternoon, the ground rose slightly and I came to the edge of a dry stream bed. A single line of mesquite trees traced its path, and at its center I saw a series of hoof prints baked into the clay. They were fresh enough to still hold shape. That meant riders or wagons had passed not long ago. I followed the stream bed as it curved gently toward the south, letting it guide me like a road laid down by nature. The last mile felt longer than all the miles behind it. My legs felt as if they were made of sand themselves, ready to crumble at each step. I kept my eyes on a tall timber structure that rose above the rest of the camp, using it as a marker that pulled me forward. Each time I looked up, it seemed no closer, but I refused to stop. I told myself that if I could reach that beam before sunset, I would find water and the company of other men who had also faced this land. As the sun lowered, throwing long copper shadows across the ground, I finally reached the outskirts of the camp. A row of small shacks stood in uneven lines near the dry stream bed. Smoke curled from the chimney of a cookhouse at the far end, and the clang of metal carried faintly through the air, proof that I had reached a place where work still echoed against the silence of the desert. I stood there a long moment, staring at the camp as the weight of the journey settled in my bones. The desert behind me stretched vast and silent, but the sight of rough roofs and the sound of distant hammers reminded me that I had made it through. That night I knew I would not sleep on bare sand again. That night I sat outside the shack they gave me, a tin cup of well water in my hands, and watched the desert fade under the rising moon. The men in the camp were already settling in after their shifts, their voices carrying across the yard in low, tired tones. The clang of the last hammer died away and left a hush that felt almost sacred after so many days of wind and empty silence. I drank slow, letting the cool water rest on my tongue before swallowing. It felt strange to drink without fear of running out. I stared at the sky above the dark plain and thought of the first step I had taken out there. How far it felt now from this place where lamplight glowed behind wooden walls. In that quiet, I realized the desert had not been just a stretch of land I crossed. It had been a test laid out like a road. It had stripped away everything I thought I needed: comfort, company, certainty, and left me standing alone to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when there was nothing left but myself. I understood then that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep walking even when you taste fear in every breath. I thought about the storm that had pinned me between boulders, the mirages that had teased me with false water, the ravine seep that had given me the strength to go one more day. Each of those moments had been a teacher in its own way. They taught me patience when I had none, caution when I wanted to rush, and gratitude for even a drop of water in a land that owed me nothing. Before I turned in, I looked back once more toward the horizon I had come from. The moonlight silvered the dunes and turned the mesquite grove into a dark silhouette. I felt as though the desert itself was watching me from that distance, and for a moment I nodded to it, as one man might nod to another after surviving a hard fight. I slept that night on a real cot with a roof over my head, yet I dreamed I was still out there following the bright southern star. In the morning I woke with a quiet pride. I had not come to the desert to prove anything, but it had given me something no wage could buy. The certainty that I could face the worst the world had to offer and still keep moving forward. If you have ever had to cross your own desert, maybe not of sand and heat, but of hardship just as fierce, then you know what I mean. You know how it feels to walk farther than you thought you could, how it changes the way you see yourself. I would like to hear about those journeys. Share them in the comments if you feel like it. You never know who might need to hear that someone else made it through their own wasteland. And if this story reached you in some way, if it reminded you of your own strength or gave you a reason to keep walking, then pass it along. Somewhere out there, someone may be standing at the edge of their own desert, wondering if they have what it takes to take that first step.